Hello and welcome. You're watching Walta TV, and today we have a very special guest, and that is Professor Lawrence Freeman, and he's well known, especially in political economic analysis. He's for Africa. We have plenty of questions, and really thank you for coming. We do appreciate that.
My pleasure to be here with you.
Right. Let's begin from the very first question regarding to what's happening in East Africa, especially in Ethiopia, and what's your view first? I know you were here in the election time. And what do you think is happening at this time?
Well, from the standpoint of the United States, my country, our policies are very foolish, and we're in danger of losing any influence we have in the Horn of Africa. And in fact, the West is losing influence actually across the entire continent of Africa because there's no commitment by the United States or any of the European nations to actually help African countries develop by empowering them with infrastructure. Infrastructure is the key to development. The Chinese are doing this, but the West is not doing this. And in fact, at the recent COP26 so-called environmental meeting in Glasgow, the Western countries tried to dictate to the African countries, you can't use your hydrocarbons, you can't use your fossil fuels for energy. And a number of the African leaders fought back, including President Buhari of Nigeria and also from Uganda. And therefore, this whole problem the West has is they don't really care about developing the continent, helping to develop the continent, raising the standard of living of people. They're fixated on importing their view of democracy on Africa, and they're losing influence everywhere. And the African people I've met, they want the United States to help. They want to be part of an ongoing positive relationship. But the United States and other European countries are just turning their back on Africa.
Mm-hmm. So do you think there's kind of another intention for this one, regarding to this one? Because Ethiopian and the U.S., mostly we had more than 100 years relationship. And what is the intention?
Well, the problem we're having with the U.S. is that you have a group of people, first of all, in the Biden administration, who are very prone to want to control the leaders of the countries. So, for example, you have a number of Biden people who are also in the Obama administration, and this was the crowd that overthrew President Gaddafi 10 years ago, because they were afraid of Gaddafi's policies for development and his relations with China and other countries. And we're seeing a similar thing here. My concern is that there's an intention for regime change in Ethiopia, because the Ethiopian leadership has gone forward in promoting development, not essentially going along with all the plans that the West has. And there is a real danger that the United States could be pushed into or pulled into by some of the international forces into a conflict in Ethiopia. You could have regime change or other means of disruption. You could have, for example, the Tigrayan crisis. The constant refrain that there's a humanitarian crisis in Tigray, ignoring Afar, ignoring Amara, but only Tigray, they would try to use this as a pretext for an intervention called responsibility to protect, known as R2P. And the R2P concept, which was formulated by George Soros of Open Society and Tony Blair, is that the Western world has a right, the so-called international community. They will decide if a leadership is protecting its population or not. And if they decide it's not, then they have the right to intervene militarily. There have been several scenarios floated for removal of Prime Minister Abiy either by the military, a regime change, responsibility to protect. All this is possible. My job is to try to stop this. And people have to understand, the United States government is not monolithic. There are many factions in the United States government. Not everybody wants to do this. But you do have a very prominent political faction, a political financial grouping, I call them an oligarchy. And they have a very big influence in Western governments. And they want to control. They believe in geopolitics. They should control the countries of the world, and everybody else has to submit to them. And they're doing the same thing now in Ethiopia.
Of course, we'll be back to the other question regarding to the development in Africa. But because we're talking about that one, I wanted to give us your reflection regarding to the demonstrations we have, the rallies in more than 30 countries in the world. And of course, this is a cry out in diasporas too. Yes. And it's a defiant holdout. And what do you think the Ethiopians and other Africans should do regarding to this one?
Well, there is a huge movement in the diaspora in the United States and around the world. The No More hashtag has obviously resonated with an attitude that people have that we should no longer be subjected to being told what to do and being intimidated by Western influence. And it's very unfortunate the United States, a longtime ally of Ethiopia, is unfortunately leading in the wrong direction on this question. But what has to be done is people have to realize the best way to fight is you've got to identify who the enemy is and what their policy is. Because if you just protest, it's good, but it'd be better if you're more focused. And contrary to articles that come out in the press, the diaspora play a very positive role. If they unite behind the idea of saying no regime change to Ethiopia, hands off Ethiopia, no more. These are the ways, the slogans we have to get out there, because if we have the diaspora, if we have African nations, if we have nations in the rest of the world, Ibero-America, Europe, Russia, China, if we have nations and leaders and people coming out and saying, we don't want a destabilization of Ethiopia, we don't want regime change, we don't want a bloodbath and chaos and war in the Horn of Africa. If this gets said over and over again loudly, and we're telling Mr. Joe Biden, President of the United States, don't get pulled into a conflict that your predecessor Obama did, which destroyed the Sahel. Do you want your legacy to be destruction of the Horn of Africa? You have to hit hard at what their intentions are. Therefore, you announce them in advance, and that has to slow them down in terms of their determination to carry them out.
Professor, the other one that I really want a reflection at is on the US-China relations, what's happening at this moment. And how do you think this relationship will affect the mostly Africans and the Ethiopians?
Yeah, well, the premier of China was just in Ethiopia, I guess, on Wednesday, and they're not going to intervene, and they're going to support Ethiopia. I mean, Ethiopia's been a very close ally of China and has done positive things in terms of infrastructure development. Ethiopia, I became attracted to Ethiopia about a dozen years ago because I was watching its commitment to infrastructure. And I'm a physical economist. I believe in how to improve an economy physically, not money, but how do you build the energy? How do you build the railroads, the roads, increase agriculture? And the Chinese have a conception of this. Going back to what I was saying earlier, with this geopolitical grouping, which exists all over the Western world, they believe that the world is fixed. There's so much wealth in the world, and they have to have at least more than 50% of it, and that everybody else has to have 49% or less. Therefore, when they see China, and don't forget, China has been a modern miracle in their economic policy. Nobody, no capitalist country, has lifted 750 million people out of poverty in 40 years, the way China has. If the United States was intelligent, which they're not that much anymore, our leadership, they would look at what China did and see if there's anything we can learn from it. But China now is a major economic power. It's never going to be put back in the box. The Belt and Road has had a very positive influence all around the world, including Europe, including Latin America, including Africa. That's not going to be put back in the box. And one of the problems that the United States has, a foolishness, is they see China as a competitor in Africa. And every president's had this. Trump had it, Obama had it, Biden has it. And they say, oh, China's making progress in Africa. They're not concerned about the development of Africans. They're concerned about stopping China. That's geopolitics. Don't let China rise up in the world. They're not caring about Africans. They want to stop China. Now, this has been explicit in the last 3-4 American presidencies. That's the kind of stupidity we're dealing with. And clearly one of the reasons that is motivating the United States to take these actions in Ethiopia and other African countries is China is a major factor. And China's influence is growing. And these geopolitical fools think they're going to stop China and they're going to stop Africa from working with China. And that's not going to happen. As we say in the United States, that horse is out of the barn, or that train has left the station. It's not going to happen. But they, in their geopolitical fanaticism of control, political economic control, they can't give up the idea that someone else they can emerge. Now, there is not an inherent objective conflict. The needs of Africa, and I've studied them in terms of electricity, are gigantic. My calculation is that Africa needs 1,000 gigawatts of electricity. Africa needs 50,000 kilometers of high-speed rail. Africa needs roads, hospitals. Therefore, the demand, the need is so great that there is no effective reason, objective reason, for the United States and China to fight each other over Africa. Not that we want to tell Africans what to do, but let us help in the key areas, which is long-term, low-interest credit for infrastructure, which the Chinese are doing. Give the Africans a chance to build the infrastructure that was denied them during the periods of slavery, colonialism, and neocolonialism. That is how we can help Africa to empower itself. And the needs of Africa are so great, there's no reason the United States, China, Russia, India, Turkey can all be involved in this development. It's in the common interest of mankind to develop Africa. It's not a conflict between competing countries. That's geopolitics. We can work with every country in the world, and we could say to ourselves, let's have a joint mission to eliminate poverty in Africa. That's something we all can work together. A joint mission to have an adequate, advanced healthcare system so people don't have to travel out of the continent for medical care. And we've got 6% of the African population vaccinated. That's absurd. Africa has to have its own manufacturing of the vaccines and distribution centers. But we can't do that without roads. You can't do that without electricity. So therefore, we should be united in assisting the development of African nations instead of this geopolitical mentality. I call it a disease that we have in the West.
So is this the uniting them? It's been said a lot, of course, we have to be united, but how united is needed? Like the union we're looking for, is it from the people, is it from the leaders, or are we expecting other like superpower countries to come to Africa and do something for us?
My view is that all human beings are created equally with the potential of creative thought. Therefore, all our needs are very similar because it's our mind, it's our ability to create, discover through our minds. That's the key to human beings. No other animal can do that. Therefore, every nation has the same obligation to develop the material standard of living of its people and to develop and nurture the creativity of its people. And you can't do one without the other. If we look around the world, we have 8-9 billion people. We're going to say, okay, well, what do we do to advance mankind, humankind? Well, we have to eliminate poverty. You can't have millions of people dying for lack of food, lack of electricity. We know how to correct those things. As I said, the Chinese just brought 750 million out of poverty. That's in the interest of mankind to develop Africa. Look, take the question of COVID-19. As long as we have the majority of the people in the world unvaccinated, this COVID-19 will mutate. We just saw another mutation this past week. Therefore, it's in the interest of the United States and the interest of Europe and the interest of every country for Africa to be completely vaccinated. So we're talking about 3 billion doses if we're doing 2 shots. These are simple questions because human beings are all similar. We all have similar aspirations to raise our family, to have our children have a better life than we, to make contributions to humanity for the future. And therefore, we should all be united in this. Leaders we don't have really advanced thinking leaders in the West right now. I think Xi Jinping has said some very positive things in this direction of the common development of mankind. The West doesn't think that way. But if we have a positive view of where civilization should go in the future, including the exploration of space, then what we have to do to get there is very obvious to me. And you can't do it if there's massive poverty. You can't do it if there's no electricity. You can't do it if people are hungry. So these are obvious things that we could help alleviate, not dictate to African countries, but help them alleviate these problems, and they can empower themselves. Africa is going to be the center of this century because its population is going to be 2.5 billion. Either that's going to be something for good, to have 2.5 billion human beings with their minds, or it could go the other way. If there's massive poverty, then there's going to be an increase in violent extremism, which is the underlying cause that leads people into these kinds of terrorist activities. But either way, Africa is the center of this century. So either we do the intelligent things or we do the stupid things. And Ethiopia has been a leader in the Horn of Africa, East Africa, and the African continent. And therefore, the United States has not supported Ethiopia. For example, we never have issued praise for the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. No American president has done that. We should have. I have. Anybody who's thoughtful say, wow, 6,200 megawatts of power in Africa where there's no power? That's good. We say nothing on it. Why? Because we're not thinking in the West. We don't have real quality leaders thinking. And that's a big problem.
Lawrence Freeman mostly is known as a political economist analyst for Africa, and there are some questions regarding to the African. And you have stated a personal mission, especially to eliminate poverty and hunger, mostly in Africa. And why do you, as Lawrence Freeman, commit yourself to this kind of grand mission?
Well, that's a long story, but I'm going on 71. I've been involved in politics since the 1960s in my country. And I've always had, my upbringing my whole life has been unusual, but in my upbringing and other activity, I've always been concerned about the welfare of human beings. And early on, when I was a teenager and I was in college, I was thinking about why are people dying for lack of food in Africa? And I began to look into it, and then I got involved in other things, and then the last 30 years, I've dedicated myself to this. Because there is no objective problem. You have people in your government now, I've met with them, and they realize that if we can increase the amount of land we cultivate, most of the land in Ethiopia, like Africa, is arable. There's large sections of arable land, but it's not cultivated. If we start increasing the acres of cultivation and increase the acres of irrigation, instead of just depending on rain, you could run 2 or 3 crops a year. Again, this goes back to electricity. To get irrigation, you have to pump water. We could eliminate shortage of food. And there is no reason for human beings to die. To me, human beings are the most precious thing we have because they're created in God's image through the power of their mind, of creativity. And to lose one single human being is a tragedy. To lose millions is horrible. And therefore, I'm committed to promoting policies that nurture and develop human beings. And the economic side is actually the easier side because the more difficult side is education and having the right culture so that we foster in our young children the thirst for creativity. But the economic side can be done, and we know what it is. And to see my country take the leadership, which I'm hoping to stop, to destabilize Ethiopia. This is why I came to Ethiopia, because I want to be here defending Ethiopia against policies to destabilize it. Because I think that if this were to occur, this would be bad for the whole continent of Africa.
But specifically, there were other countries that we could have picked, but why did we choose Ethiopia? Of course, we can see that it's the Horn of Africa, but what other points do we think that we should focus on?
Well, as I say, the question is, how do you build a continent? Okay, there's no transportation on the continent. There are programs to build what's called the African High-Speed Integrated Rail Network. It's part of the African Union Agenda 2063. Well, that's 40 years from now. We can't wait 40 years. There's a Nigerian businessman who I've been in touch with, and he says we could do it in 13 years. Why not? Imagine if you had all the major ports, all the major capitals, all the major cities on the African continent connected by high-speed rail. Do you realize that you would have a revolution in economic development? It would change everything. Imagine if you have the East-West Railroad connecting the Indian Ocean to the Atlantic Ocean, north-south connecting the Mediterranean and Europe to the Cape in South Africa, and then all kinds of lines, north and south in between, east and west. You could change everything on this continent. Africa has the capability to be a net food exporter, not buying food, which African countries are still doing. Your country included, we spend about $35 billion on food imports. It's a waste of money. We can be self-sufficient in food in Africa. And Africa could produce enough food that we would ship it out to other parts of the world. So Ethiopia has because of its very interesting, unique history as an independent nation, never colonized, and the commitment by Meles Zenawi and others for infrastructure development, what he called the developmental state, Ethiopia has emerged, even as a poor country, has put forth very aggressive, bold ideas for development, such as the GERD, Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. So there's something very interesting in the Ethiopian mindset of people, and it has to do a lot with your history, that allows them to think boldly about accomplishing things that other countries don't. And that's an interesting quality to me, and therefore I've been wanting to promote that quality over the many years I've been coming to your country.
Yeah, Professor Lawrence, when I was trying to do a little research, I just found a name related, of course, to Alexander Hamilton.
Yes.
You're a lot related to that. And why do you feel Hamilton's scientific economic principles would help Africa, mostly, especially Africa, and regarding to elimination of this poverty and hunger?
Well, Alexander Hamilton, first of all, he was came from the Caribbean, so he was an immigrant, and he was a genius. And during the Revolutionary War, he was George Washington's aide-de-camp. And of course, the whole history of our Revolutionary battle is exceptional. But Hamilton, when the country finally was free from the British, we were very much like Africa. We were 13 colonies. We were totally bankrupt. We had $72 million in debt, international debt, local debt, state debt, and we were all agrarian-based. We had no manufacturing capability. Hamilton reorganized the entire economy, reorganized the debt, set up a national bank, called the First National Bank, which would be a bank that people would use, and it would have government backing to issue credit for manufacturing. He wrote a long paper. He wrote several books, but he wrote one long treatise on manufacture. The importance of having a manufacturing sector would actually complement and enhance the agricultural sector. We had a whole bunch of backward people in the country then, led by Thomas Jefferson and others, who said, no, agriculture is key, state rights are key, slavery has to exist. And Hamilton said, no, we have to have manufacturing. And he set up the foundations of our economy, which made us the greatest economy in the world, and rapidly we moved to be an industrial power. His concepts have been used and abused throughout the 200 plus years of my country's existence. We've had some presidents who have adopted them: John Quincy Adams, Abraham Lincoln, Franklin Roosevelt. And when people adopt Hamilton's principles, the economy grows. And when they don't, it shrinks. And the other key thing is you have to have a united country. So Hamilton took the debt of all the 13 colonies and he unified it into one debt and then said, we will have a dedicated fund to pay it off. Now think of that situation. We were faced with a separatist state movement, and Hamilton united it into one cohesive nation where the central government had substantial power and obligation for the citizens. Now, you look at your situation in Ethiopia today, one of the problems we're having is regional ethnicity is always a mistake, because you have to have a central government that acts in the interest of all its people. And you can't have ethnic groups deciding, well, this is good for us. We want this control. We want this power. No, there is a united Ethiopia. And we have to reaffirm a Ethiopian citizen that is superior to the concept of a ethnic background or group. There's something about being a citizen of a nation state that is more important and more fundamental than being a Tigrayan or Oromo, etc.
Is there any lesson that we could take from other countries that we don't have to comment right here? Is there any good example we can take? Maybe we can learn from that one.
Well, you have to look at the negative side of it, and you look at countries where the domination was on ethnicity, and those countries get destroyed. And therefore, if you look at, for example, the co-conception of the nation state was not, we developed it. Human beings developed it. It started in the 1400s and kept progressing and progressing. And in the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, we actually defined the nation state. And the idea is that nations can cooperate with other nations in the interest and development of mankind. All nations that make progress because the people aspire to a concept of a sovereign nation that acts in their interest. For example, if you look at the U.S. Constitution, the most important part of the U.S. Constitution is the preamble, where it says, it lays out what the nation is supposed to do. We are supposed to provide for the general welfare of our people living today and their posterity. Your Constitution doesn't define one people. It defines peoples, plural. It defines nationalities, plural. And that's a mistake. And once we get through this conflict, which hopefully we will soon, we're going to have to revisit. As a friend of Ethiopia, I can say we're going to have to revisit the Constitution, because you can't have regional movements based on ethnicity deciding the future of a nation state. So the United States is a good example. Now, we made mistakes in our own history, and we're still paying for them by the continuation of backward forms of racism that have not been eliminated in the United States.
Yeah, talking about the future, what lies the future of Africa and Ethiopia?
Well, that's a good question, because it's going to depend on what we do. As I say, Africa is projected to go from about 1.3 billion people to 2.5 billion people in 30 years by 2050. Now, that's a lot, and 1 billion of them are going to be young people, according to projections. Now, do we have the material qualities of life for those 1 billion young people and their families so they can grow up in a better conditions and use their minds to make great discoveries, to become astrophysicists? We have this young Senegalese woman who's an astrophysicist in Africa. I think she's the first one. And we want to have a density of young people making great economic, philosophical, scientific discoveries. If we don't change our policies today, then 30 years from now, and those young people don't have jobs, don't have hope for a future, don't see the potential of raising their families, then Boko Haram is going to look pretty small compared to what the potential is for that kind of disaster. I'll give you an example. You have a great, you had a great leader in the continent many years ago, Cheikh Anta Diop. And most people don't know who he is. He was an Egyptian scholar, he was an anthropologist, but he wrote a book in the 1960s on the Federated State of Africa. And at that point, he envisioned that each African country would have a complete energy grid sufficient for its development by the 1980s. He envisioned nuclear energy across the continent, which only exists now in South Africa. He talked about training centers for engineers, for scientists. So we had thinkers like that. Kwame Nkrumah understood some of the key points of economic development. but they were snuffed out. They were stifled by neo-colonialism after colonialism. We have to free the African continent from these restrictions that have been holding it back for half a millennium. 500 years Africa's been held back. Slavery, colonialism, neo-colonialism, geopolitics. We have to jettison all that, and we have to get back to the commitment to developing human beings. And since Africa is going to have, as a continent, more human beings than anywhere else in the world on one continent, either we're smart enough to help in that development for the future, or we're so stupid that we don't, in which case it's going to come back on us in terms of the kinds of things we see when we don't develop places and we see the rise of extremism and violence and disease.
Can we relate that one mostly to the hands of the partners, mostly in the development partners, like that of the IMF and other agencies?
The IMF has never developed one country successfully, so they have no good track record. You may not remember this, but it was the IMF and the World Bank, Washington, Paris, and London, who in 1985 said, we have to change Africa. And they did it by implementing something called the Structural Adjustment Programs. They were called, otherwise known as SAPs, S-A-P-S. And what they did, and because I did a lot of work in Nigeria in the 90s, and take Nigeria's case, they basically stopped subsidies for agriculture, they stopped infrastructure, they devalued currencies, and because they said if all the African countries would accept these new macroeconomic conditions to satisfy the Western financial system, they will be better off. And they destroyed every African country that followed them. And therefore we have no manufacturing sectors of significance in Africa today, which is a crime. This is the kind of problem. So the IMF and World Bank, I would ignore their advice. The WTO, similarly, we have problems. What we have to do is we have to form a new paradigm. We have to have a new paradigm in the world based on development, that all nations would conspire together for the development of humankind and civilization for the next 20, 40 years. That means we have to build hospitals. We have to spend billions of dollars building hospitals. As I said, we have to have electricity. We have to have transportation. We have to have schools. I was looking at a report I was asked to do on Central African Republic. They have 80 children per one teacher. That's an abomination. I cut it in half and said, how many schools are we going to need if we have 40 children per one teacher? We have to build 12,000 schools just in CAR. So think about how many schools we have to build, how many hospitals. Now, if a hospital is going to function, they have to have electricity 24/7. If you're going to have these vaccines, you're going to have electricity for refrigeration to keep them cold. Then you have to have transportation to get out to the population to vaccinate them. Just think about what you need to do to develop a top-level health infrastructure. You need training centers to train nurses, to train doctors. We need training centers for scientists. So the demands are enormous. And this is the future. So we need a new paradigm of development, not controlled by geopolitics and not controlled by the Western financial institutions. We have to change our thinking in the West. I am trying to do this in my country, and I'm trying to protect Africa from the dangers of geopolitics. That's why in the midst of telling the U.S. Embassy, saying, don't come to Addis, it's dangerous, there's a level 4 advisory, I came. I wanted to be in, there's no place I'd rather be than in Ethiopia defending the Ethiopian people, because that was all psychological warfare. There was no truth to any of it. We can see that. They can see that. They're doing it as it's a form of warfare. Psychological warfare is to weaken the resolve of people to fight by using fear and intimidation. So I figured I may as well come here and try to counteract it.
What do you think every Ethiopian should do at this time?
What we have to do is we have to get past this conflict. Obviously, there's a military component to it, but it's going to have to be politics and a political negotiation. Then we're going to have to move into a very tricky area where we're going to have an open debate among all Ethiopians on the question of the difference between ethnicity and citizenship. And it's going to be very contentious. But we have to have through dialogue and discussion, even if it gets ruckus, because we have to come out of this thing that there is a conception of a unified Ethiopia and a conception of a citizen of Ethiopia. And we have to then, Ethiopia has to reemerge, continue its fight to lead for development in the Horn of Africa. Without massive infrastructure development on the African continent, we are not going to achieve the results we want. And we're going to be overrun if we have 1 billion young people and there's no electricity and there's no roads and there's no jobs and there's no manufacturing sector, then we're in trouble. So let's make a commitment now, get past this war, solve this problem of ethnicity, and then get on to the primary task of a new paradigm for development.
Lawrence Freeman, I wish we had more time that we could talk other points more regarding to the politics and the economic, mostly to Africa. Hopefully we'll have another time.
Yes.
And really, thank you for coming.
My pleasure. This is where I want to be.
Right, appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.